Welcome to the 5 a.m. podcast, where we bring you insightful conversations with thought leaders and influencers who are making headway and some waves in their callings. Today, we're thrilled to have with us a visionary in the field of education. Marsha Familaro-Enright is not just an educator, she has her eyes firmly set to the future and has dedicated her career to transforming how we think about learning and personal growth. With over 25 years' experience running a successful Montessori school, Marsha has been at the forefront of challenging conventional wisdom in education. She's the founder of the Great Connection Seminars, a great books-based program that is reshaping how young adults engage with knowledge and ideas. Now, Marsha wants to provide a groundbreaking higher education experience designed to produce the next generation of self-reliant leaders. Marsha's work sits at the intersection of education, philosophy, and personal development. She's here to share her insights on how we can empower people to think for themselves, become leaders of their own lives, and thrive in a complex world. Now, whether you're an entrepreneur, a parent, an educator, or simply someone passionate about self-improvement and critical thinking, you are in for a treat. But before we dive into this conversation that promises to challenge our assumptions about education, inspire us to think bigger, and provide actionable insights for living smarter, please share this episode, this conversation with your friends and networks. I know many are going to enjoy this conversation. There's two other things. If you could remember to be so kind as to give 5 a.m. Podcast a 5-star review on your favorite podcast player, we would appreciate it. And we would like to thank those who ventured over to buymeacoffee.com/5am podcast and bought us a few cups of coffee this week and last. Now, we do appreciate their support. And if you want to join those early risers who've bought in to support the mission of the 5 a.m. podcast, we welcome you to join us in our mission to help others seize their days. Now, let's roll that intro. Marsha, welcome to the 5 a.m. podcast. So glad to have you here.
Thank you so much and to have me and for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's good to get it in. And I was, I usually have a whole list of questions, which I do in this case. And I was trained many years ago by a man much smarter than me, still probably to this day, that I could ask the first one that I had written down, but I could never ask the other ones on the list because I had two ears and one mouth. And Jim wanted me to listen and ask a question. So I was watching one of your videos, and you were talking about the individual versus the collectivist. And maybe we could actually start there on that approach to education and what kind of life road does that actually create for the individual and society?
Well, if a person wants to thrive in life, the best environment is a free society. We know that from history. We know that from comparing North Korea to South Korea. But the question is, how does a person have to act in order to be able to exist in a free society? They have to have the ability to judge things for themselves. They have to be self-reliant. They have to know how to navigate life. There's a lot of qualities that they need, and they have to know how to defend their individual rights and their right to a free society. So these are all important things in order to maintain such a life.
That makes sense. That stands to reason that if you're as a child, when we're intellectual sponges and we can take up languages and thought and systems of thoughts, it makes so much sense then that if a child is not trained to defend a position or defend a belief when they're a child, they can't actually do it when they're an adult. Is that correct?
They can learn. They usually can learn, but not in the as it's not going to be as incorporated as deeply in their own being as it is if they learned how to do that as a child. And the way I think of it is that children, if they're going to be independent, they need to learn how to judge anything for themselves, not necessarily have a particular point of view. They need to examine the facts. They need to learn enough. They need to have enough experience that they can then decide this is the way that I want to live and that I'm going to do well, and this is why. And of course, they need to learn the why on the way along, Um, but then it's very deeply incorporated in them. And, it's very interesting. There was a very influential French aristocrat who came to the U.S. in the 1830s named Alexis de Tocqueville. And he came over to study our prison system, but then he ended up writing this hugely influential book called Democracy in America, in which he examined all kinds of things about the U.S. and what it was like and why it was different and what was good about it and what was a danger. And one of the things he said was that the earliest settlers in New England came over not for fortune, not for money, but for an idea of freedom. And they had about 200 years where they were basically left alone by the British government because they were insignificant. And he called it their apprenticeship of freedom. So they had the opportunity to learn how to self-rule. And they didn't always do it the right way. I mean, we had the witch trials and things like that, but they had an opportunity to self-organize in a way that you don't get in the modern world as much. I mean, where do our young people learn how to live in freedom? Do we give them that opportunity? So
Yeah.
it's an important issue.
Yeah, absolutely. You've stated, and this is one of my questions that I've written down. So you've stated that education is broken. Can you elaborate on what you see as, is there one fundamental flaw in our current education system?
One fundamental,
Or maybe
well,
there's more.
the one fundamental flaw is it's not aimed at how do you develop a person to be able to be self-responsible, self-reliant. It's aimed at all kinds of other things that are many times politically motivated. For example, a big problem that's happened in the U.S. is, as far as I'm concerned, is they put this program in about 30 years ago called No Child Left Behind, in which they were supposed to be making sure that all children were educated correctly. But what happened was it was like I'm sorry, it was like a Soviet style top down program that wasn't sensitive to individual areas, individual needs, individual children. And everyone was supposed to be able to pass this one test. Well, what happens in the public schools where, they're funded by the government, the teachers end up teaching to the test because the money that they were getting from the federal government was dependent on the test scores. And they got rid of all kinds of very important activities like recess, music, art, and all kinds of things. And we have spent more and more money since the 70s on public schools, and their children's ability to learn has just gone way down.
Uh-huh.
So this is a big problem.
Yeah.
Another major problem is a set of ideas that have been very ascendant in the intellectual life of Western society, which is postmodernism. I don't know how familiar you or your audience is, but it's these ideas that came out of communism. Actually, it was a lot of people who they realized that the original claims of communism about how the Soviets were going to outdo the capitalist societies, the workers were going to take over, and they were a complete bunkum, and they were a disaster, right? And but there were all these intellectuals who did not want to give up on those ideas. And so they came up with this new way of thinking about it that was ended up being called postmodernism. And in those beliefs, they said there is no objective reality, there is no objective right and wrong. It's all about what your social group believes, and it's a matter of power struggles. And this has infiltrated academia and what they're teaching in the schools everywhere.
And as we're talking, I'm thinking about, I realize now it's like a mini series, but the book by Amor Towles, I believe is how you pronounce his last name, The Gentleman in Moscow.
Hmm.
and how I mean, they did actually have to rip all the labels off the wine bottles because
Yes,
you could not have, this, I don't know, a Bordeaux from 1795, and have that, not going to someone that had no appreciation for it whatsoever. But when you think of that whole entire uh, a set of thoughts and ideas that became this oppressive reality. And now you see how, in the Common Core, in these collectivist, globalist, if you will, uh, ideologies for education, they actually take away the music, the arts, the vocational classes, and we're ended up with automatons almost. And how can, um through your system or through your ideas that you had in your career, let's say, how can we break through those borders that are been trying to be put around us?
break through them
Let's say that,
politically, or
yeah, maybe well, it seems like the ideas that come are they're as old as time. They're a
yes,
politically motivated way of actually shackling people and making them fit in to be just less than a worker bee, if you will.
hmm
And so, where do parents go? Let's say, um, once they see this happening, are
yeah,
there
well,
some?
parents want to get their children out of that kind of education if they can,
Yeah,
as best they can, or maybe if they can't, maybe at home, give them counterpoints to what they're learning in school.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
Books to read.
right, or even the conversations. I mean,
Hmm.
we often had conversations when my children were little. We never specifically um, promoted to them a certain ideology. We just would answer their questions with our reasoning about what was right or wrong. And then we left it up to them to decide what they thought about it. But there's a lot of issues that happen. I remember my 6-year-old daughter coming home. Now, I live in Chicago near one of the Great Lakes, right? One of the biggest lakes in the
Yes.
world, Lake Michigan. And I remember her coming home. There is a little 6-page newspaper for children called Weekly Reader in the United States that many, many schools use, and we had it at our Montessori school. And she came home and she was all worried about running out of water because of what she read in Weekly Reader, because they were pushing all the environmentalism and the radical environmentalism. And so I just said to her, well, remember that really big lake that we live near,
Yeah.
which we've been
Yeah.
to many times? We don't have to worry about running out of water. And that kind of thing. The parents can give counterpoints just with facts, right? And
Hmm.
evidence and reasoning to
Yeah.
what they might hear at school, but they have to have a good relationship with the children, a
Yes.
good dialogue with the children
Right.
to be able to do that. So,
So, can I ask you then? Are there a few main points that you feel sets apart the Montessori system from the regular public school?
oh, hugely. It's
Okay.
hugely different. Yeah, hugely different. The program is aimed at the individual child. The Throughout the Montessori system, each child works at their own pace, and they work on their material that they're interested in. They end up doing a lot of collaboration as they get older, especially with other children, and that's good because when you're at work, you need to know how to collaborate with other people.
Right.
Uh, but it's still aimed at what does that individual child need? What pace do they need to learn at? How do they need to learn? And in case anybody's not familiar, the Montessori system has this huge array of materials that we use to learn concepts that are kind of like games that that teach math, language, history, um, geography, just these beautiful materials for that children just love. And so the teacher is very focused on what is this individual child like and what do they need to thrive. And the whole program is organized around that. And there's many aspects to it I could tell you about, but I don't know how much time we
No,
have.
that's
So
okay. Oh,
yeah,
we've got time, but we have more talking points, I think, than we have
yeah.
time. But I was going
Yeah.
to ask you, I was thinking as I was getting ready for this conversation, I was thinking back to just starting junior high, and I I've always been really good at like spatial recognition, pattern recognition, those kinds of things. I can do very well on an IQ test because I love to see which comes next in the pattern. That's always been
Hmm.
great for me. But there's other things that I encountered in school that just did not fit with my brain. And I
Hmm.
was talking with my friend Todd once, and we were getting ready for this test, and he said, "Well, you know, Michael, this the only thing in here is how we remember what the teacher told us, and then we put it on the paper. You don't actually have to think for yourself."
Hmm.
And I grew up on
Exactly.
a farm, thinking for myself.
Hmm.
And can you talk a little bit about um, the importance of ensuring that that younger generation that's growing up is thinking for themselves? They're not just being the best memorizer of the content.
Well, especially when you look at our technologically oriented society that's constantly changing, where jobs are constantly changing, it's really important. I mean, it's always important in human life, but it's really important in a society like this to be able to adapt to new circumstances, to be able to constantly learn. And in order to do that, you have to know how to think well. You have to know how to learn any kind of material that you might need, and you have to be able to reason about it well, and figure out how to solve problems. You can't do that by just parroting back whatever your teacher told you. You have to be able to process it. So that's a super important skill. Um, and it's interesting. I've talked to many employers these days who are really frustrated because they say to me, "I can't find people who can solve problems." And I think that's because they've been through this kind of, you know, factory type system.
Yeah, and I suppose that might be one of those lights that went off for you in the project for Reliance College.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how that kind of got going and what that is, and maybe where on the spectrum of of start to completion it is?
Sure. Well, it's a long story. It starts when I was a kid, and I really loved school and I loved learning. And I was very frustrated by the other kids goofing around until I realized that they were frustrated because didn't, they couldn't learn enjoyably in the kind of situation that we were in. So I thought to myself, well, I don't want that for my own children. I'm going to find out what kind of program would work really well. And when I was about 20, I came across some articles about the Montessori method, and I thought, this sounds really good. And then I went and educated myself on everything about it. I read everything I could about it. And then I started visiting Montessori schools and sent my son, oldest child was a son, a Montessori um, preschool. And then when it came to elementary school, there was kind of a problem. And I managed to meet some other people who were also interested in Montessori elementary. And I said, why don't we start our own school? So I did that, ran that for about 27 years. But my own interest was always in young adult learners. And I could see what was going on in the colleges decades ago. I could see the kind of undermining of Western civilization. I could see the undermining of reasoning, of the belief that there is truth, um, yeah, of the learning about what's happened in the past, the learning of history, of civics, and all this, and that was going on in the universities and getting worse and worse. And I thought, you know, we people on the side of a free society, we should have our own school. And that's when I first got the idea that we should have a college. This was quite a long time ago. So I started a summer program, a week-long summer program, where I put everything I knew about optimal education into it. Especially one of the important principles in Montessori education is that the founder recognized 100 years ago was that there are different stages of development in learning, and that that in order for the person to really develop well, you need to address their needs, their learning needs, in order for them to really comprehend material and to get a lot out of it and to be able to use it in their own life. So I took those ideas up to the young adult level and applied it. and integrated it with the idea of, okay, what kind of program do you need for a young person to learn how to think for themselves, to be able to judge anything for themselves without an authority, to know about the range of ideas that are out there, to get an idea about that and get enthusiastic about it. And I put all that into this summer program, and started that 15 years ago. It's called The Great Connections. And even from the first year, I was surprised at the outcome, because I would get the vast majority of the students at the end of a week telling me my life has been transformed because now I can judge anything myself. And you just would see their confidence going up as the week went on. It's a beautiful thing what happens. And these students end up becoming lifelong friends. Interestingly, I recently interviewed a one of the students from one of the original programs, and he had come twice or three times, and he explained to me why they get to be such good friends. He said, when you're in class, in the kind of discussions that we hold, which is a specialized form of a collaborative discussion, he says, you get to see the way the other person's mind works. And then out of class, you get to know them personally. So he says, in the end, you know them better than almost anybody you know. So
Fascinating. And is that the Socratic discussion or Socratic dialogue? Is that part of
yes,
it?
yes. And I just want to make clear, people get confused sometimes by the phrase Socratic seminar or Socratic
Okay.
dialogue, because they might have seen, there was an old show called The Paper Chase about law school. Um,
Okay.
or they might know where it was a matter of the teacher throwing out questions and the students answering. And then if they didn't get it right, it was kind of like a gotcha. And Socrates himself can be like that too, if you read the dialogues. But this isn't the way our discussions are at all. This is about really listening to what the other person says and using reason and evidence for whatever your opinion is. So what we do is we have a common object of learning. Is usually a text, like something from Socrates, something from Marcuse, something from Bastiat, all these different famous writers. We all read it, and then we discuss what does he mean, or what does she mean in this uh, paper. And people will come with lots of different ideas about what this part of this paper means, what that part of this paper means. And what we're trying to do is think well together in order to be independent, to come to our own conclusions, and to really understand what the author is saying. The students learn how to read fantastically with this, because we're guiding them about how to do it well. And you learn a lot. You develop kind of a Swiss Army knife of reasoning skills, because you see how other people approach the same material, and you gain skills by that. Oh, I can do it this way, or I could do it the way that person did. And so they they have to really listen carefully to each other, respond to what the other person is saying, and then come in with your own thoughts about it. But you have to also show, well, where in what the author is saying supports my opinion about this, and or what other general things might support my opinion. You have to give your reason and evidence.
Yeah. So does that fit along with the trivium of the grammar, logic, and rhetoric
Mm-hmm. For
aspect
sure.
of it? Now, I
Sure.
wanted to ask you briefly about how people can get in touch with you.
Sure. Well, my email is marsha@reliancecollege.org. Our website is reliancecollege.org. And I want to mention that we are running another one of our summer programs this summer, July 26th to August 2nd in Chicago. You can find information about it on our website. And I've had students from all over the world come to the program, at least as far as Nepal and the Philippines and Argentina, Canada,
Right.
everywhere.
Wow. That's great. I wanted to ask you about the Frankfurt School
Mhm.
of Thought. Can you kind of compare what you're doing, or contrast maybe what you're doing with what was the ideology behind the Frankfurt School, and how we actually see the tentacles? Maybe I'm biasing this by saying tentacles, but can you talk a little bit about those two almost maybe they're diametrically opposing ideas?
I think you're right in many respects they are. The Frankfurt School, I don't know, I'm not an expert in that. I know
Okay.
somewhat about it, but those are some of the people that are the source of what's called postmodernism. Those are the people that I was mentioning who were wanted to still advocate communism and realized that it wasn't working in the old style, so they had to come up with a new rationale for it. So, for example, Herbert Marcuse wrote quite a bit about in this postmodernist thinking, and one of his most influential and famous essays is Repressive Tolerance. You can look. There's a website for Marcuse. All his writings. It's very easy to look them up. Repressive tolerance basically says that the free thought in a free society is repressive against certain other people, and he gives his reasoning about this. So this is this is the kind of thing that gets the people on the postmodernist, or now we call them progressive left, to be very strong about shutting other people up. This is some of the source of cancel culture, of intimidating people into not arguing their position. Also, the Frankfurt School is part of the group that believes there is no objective truth. And so it's all about a struggle of power. So they don't care about reasoning with you. They don't care. This is why they don't care about debating or anything like that. They
Yeah.
will shout you down
Yeah.
because they want to grab that power. And of course, it's interesting to think about why are they so afraid of reasoning, right? I think it's because reason and facts are on the side of a free society in terms of what is the best way to live. And so they don't want to debate because they're going to lose.
Yeah. Well, that makes me think this will be a shameless plug for an episode I have coming out on Wednesday with Jonathan Newman from the Mises Institute. And of course, who doesn't love a good Murray Rothbard conversation? Well, globalists and collectivists won't. But I want to ask you about great books because that's part of what you do as well. And we were talking with that briefly before we just started, the great books one must read. And I know in past times as a senior producer of picking books for my team to read through the month that we would discuss at our weekly meetings, I was always looking for old books to find. Can you talk about some of those great books from the past that are integral to today?
Sure. So great books refers to what used to be called the classics, or the old books from antiquity, Middle Ages, 18th century, that were the most influential on people's thought. At one time during the Enlightenment, for example, and most of the 19th century, and even up until maybe the 1920s, almost everybody who was well educated had what we call a liberal arts education, an Enlightenment liberal arts education. This term has gotten really misunderstood because of what the left has done with liberal arts in many colleges. But think about it, the word liberal comes from the same root as liberty. It meant the kind of education you needed to be a free person. And to be a free person, you have to understand the ideas that have shaped the very culture around you. And these are the ideas of the most influential thinkers and the best writers in history. This is why you have to know about them, because otherwise you're taking on ideas without even knowing where they came from, not knowing their implications, not knowing their connections. But when you learn from the great books, you discover, oh, I got the idea of actual and potential from Aristotle. I didn't know that. You know, people never think about we take for granted the idea that we know that something is actually one thing and potentially another thing. But that was actually something he discovered that solves a dilemma they had in the ancient world. And there's just many, many ideas like that. For example, modern day people are hugely influenced by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who wrote in the 1700s. They don't know that, but he was one of these people who really believed in the idea that oh, everything was so wonderful before civilization came around and before industrialization. It was the noble savage idea.
Yeah.
Um, and he believed in a very collectivist idea of human being, of how human beings should live with each other.
Yeah,
So there's lots of examples like that.
and that's a great comment from about regarding Rousseau. There was recently some memes, well, maybe about a year ago, of how opulent the serfs were living in on their
What the
serfdoms,
heck?
and so but if we think of, I often think of Edward Bernays' book Propaganda, and especially working in media. And so you realize if we don't know what was going on, and we don't know, maybe this Rousseau was a scoundrel. Perhaps this is where the idea of glorifying the world of the serf comes from in our modern world of, you can just own nothing and be happy. We'll give you this 400 square foot cubicle for you and maybe one or two other people, if we let you, can stay in it with you. So it's when we think back to those thinkers, there's nothing new under the sun, it has been said. So obviously, the thoughts that we have now, they're rooted in something else, and so it's excellent to read these great books. One of the books that I had my staff read, and it was a bit hard to get in because ladies and gentlemen, when you're reading a book from the 1800s that hasn't been updated, it's a little, you
Mm-hmm.
really got to dig into
Mm-hmm.
it and stick with it. But the book
Mm-hmm.
called The Crowd by Gustave Le Bon
Mm-hmm.
was recommended to me by a local doctor. And what a book, ladies and gentlemen. When you read that book or others that Marsha's talked about today, I mean, you realize that what we're going through is a tale as old as time.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Marsha, as we're getting close to wrapping up, I wanted to ask if you could give a piece of advice to someone who's looking to take control of their personal growth and their personal education, or maybe that of their children. What would that piece of advice be?
Look for the learning that's about, especially shore up your ability to reason about things. There's all kinds of books, there's websites you can read that can help you learn about logical fallacies, about different kinds of reasoning. And reading these great books is a great way to develop your reasoning. And one of the things, Michael, that I think makes people not read them is that they are difficult. And that's why having these reading circles where you're using this collaborative discussion to read it together, it just opens up the books for you, because you learn things in that discussion from the way other people are approaching that you might not have thought yourself, and it just really, really helps you to be able
Yeah.
to understand them. So
Yeah, going around the table. And, coming from a Christian perspective, I often think of that Bible verse that says, "Come, let us reason together."
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And if we can reason together, well, then we have less animosity towards one another, and we actually find the holes in our own logic. That
that's right.
trivium, would you mind talking just a little bit about the trivium, about the grammar, logic, and rhetoric?
Yeah, those were the subjects which the ancients discovered were very important to learn when you were going to get an education. So grammar is what they're talking about with grammar is more than just learning the parts of speech. It's learning how language works and being able to see the relationship between different parts of what a person is saying. Rhetoric is the ability not only to know how to speak well, but to know how to persuade other people. It's very interesting. If you read Aristotle's Rhetoric, it's mainly a work of psychology, not a work of language at all. Um, and of course in the Quadrivium you learned geometry, which is mathematical reasoning. Euclid's book on geometry was a mainstay of the ancient world, and if you read it, you see that he proceeds in a very precise way from fundamentals through the reasoning about every part. So it's not just learning geometry, but it's learning about how to think
Yeah,
when you're learning from Euclid.
right.
So these subjects are very important in developing your mind and introducing you to some of the best thinking.
Yeah. And I'm fortunate to have a wife that knows who at least some of the Stoics are. And we were actually just talking this morning about a quote that we're using, and it's great to dig into that those older books, as I would say. But the reason I'm bringing that up is I was reading the letters of Seneca that he wrote, and so that's over 2,000 years old. And as he documents the political problems that they're having in Rome, he could be reading something from this very year.
Absolutely.
And,
Absolutely. Yes.
and
Yeah.
human nature just doesn't change. And so to look back and think of some of the political types that I've been able to work with in my career, how they've talked about reading very old books, or fellas that I know who are in the military that go back to read perhaps even Caesar's diary on the Gaul War.
Mhm.
It's fascinating for me to go back and do
The
this, but
Iliad.
and the Iliad and Homer, those books. Could you describe how important the Iliad and the Odyssey were to the people of their time?
The Iliad and the Odyssey were written about, they think about 800, or they composed, excuse me. They weren't written down until later, but composed about 800 BC, about a war that happened around 1200 BC. But the Iliad is about the a war the Greeks had with Troy over Helen. That's uh, you know, the stated reason. There's
Right.
probably a lot more reasons they had a war,
Yeah.
but it has so much in it about human nature, about what happens when somebody has power, how to persuade other people, what the influence uh, of love is on human action, um, what happens when somebody who is important in a situation like this just goes on strike, like Achilles did, because he gets mad at Menelaus or Agamemnon, and um, there's so many lessons in it that are critical to today, and it had a great influence on the ancient world because the Greeks all knew it and they studied it carefully and they analyzed what it meant to be a great person and how to live a good life from the way in which certain of the characters acted. And they took a lot of lessons from that. And then the Odyssey, of course, is about one of the generals trying to get home after the war, Odysseus, and how it takes him 10 years to do that, and all of the adventures and the terrible things that happen to him, and how he does that. So it has so much richness to it that influenced the way people thought
Yeah.
throughout the ancient world.
Yeah. And time was completely thought of as completely different. Uh, as we're chatting, I'm in 10 years to get home. I mean, that shows determination, and
Yes,
that shows uh, resilience and persistence to a goal.
great
These are
points.
things that we do not learn from the box office hits.
Mhm, mhm.
They might try and copy them or shade them or modify them, but even if we think of the time of the Mongols and Russia was, I mean, it was started by the Swedes, a couple of Swedish brothers that start Russia, and so this nation of Russia. I'm going somewhere with this, ladies and gentlemen. So just bear with me. They got taken over by these Mongols, and the czars would have to travel by foot or donkey or horse to the capital of the Mongol Empire. It would take them 4 years to go one direction, and then they might die on the way back, and the
Mhm.
people would never hear from their leader again. And so when we think of these, what our ancestors did and wrote down, how can we not learn from them?
Mhm. Exactly.
How can we not learn from them?
I know one writer that's not talked about as much, but I think is just very revealing is the poetess Sappho, who wrote in about 650 BC. She was the first of what we call a lyric poet, which means a person who's talking about inner feelings and relationships. And if you read that, it's not only is it absolutely beautiful, but it could be today. I mean, it's the feelings are the same. So it goes to your point that human beings haven't changed.
Change. Now,
Yeah. And she was so famous in the ancient time, they just called her the poetess.
is that right?
Yeah.
Wow.
And she was
Fascinating.
considered like fourth muse or something like that.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
fascinating. I would even, wouldn't you just love to know what was in the Library of Alexandria?
Yes.
And
Yes.
and why did those Visigoths have to burn it down? Well, they hated advancement, I suppose. But
Yeah. Yeah.
that's my take. That's who I say is the culprits of the arsonists that burned down that library. But anyway, we need to wrap things up. And unless you have any last words, I would love to hear if you have any last words on our
Um,
conversation.
I just I welcome parents or anybody who'd like to contact me about education. I'm happy to help them, offer them resources and ideas for their own children. And I invite anybody who might be interested, any um, older students or parents, to please take a look at our program for the Great Connections and our program for Reliance College. We are planning to open in the fall of 2026 in Chicago. And it's a combination of a very uniquely designed and very rigorous liberal arts program, including learning logic, a special writing program, statistics, economics, finance, and a portion of the year the student will be doing practical work in
Wow.
their area of professional interest.
Wow. That sounds wonderful. Sounds like something
Thank
I
you.
would have loved to have had when I was in Chicago as a teenager after high school, but the timing was off, so I guess it wasn't meant to be. But we're talking about it now. I have a few names actually of some young people I know who would probably love it. And but as we do wrap up, I would like to remind our viewers and our listeners that Marsha has a great website with some good resources there. You can go to reliancecollege.org/blog, and there are some great articles and information there. So be sure to check that out. And there is a recent post on the Socratic discussion. So, Marsha, thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your insights.
Thank you so much for having me.
It was my pleasure. And thank you to our viewers. We do appreciate you joining in on this conversation. And if you haven't already, I would admonish you, there's a good long $25 word, to please share this channel and this episode with your friends and networks. We know many are going to enjoy this conversation, and it has one that I know carries value for that next generation. So, one other thing, if you could be so kind as to leave a 5-star review today on your favorite podcast player where you're listening to this, we would appreciate it. And of course, I need to be grateful and thank those who ventured over to buymeacoffee.com/5am podcast. We do appreciate your participation there as well. And thank you so much for listening in today, for sharing, and just for participating with Marsha and I in this conversation today. Thanks so much. We hope that you're going to seize your day with this information. And don't forget to enjoy those sunrises and sunsets. I'm Michael Clausen.